Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you again for attending today's Moos Family Speaker Series. My name is Valerie Forbes and I'm Dean of the College of Biological Sciences at University of Minnesota, who is co-hosting this event together with Freshwater. We want to especially thank our generous sponsors today, Stantec, Designing with Community in Mind, and the Consulate General of Canada, located here in Minneapolis. As you may know, tomorrow is Give to the Max Day, Minnesota's annual day of giving, where tens of thousands of Minnesotans donate millions of dollars to Minnesota schools and nonprofits. Freshwater, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, relies heavily on donations from people like you to propel our mission forward. If you value Moos speakers, a free public lecture series, and other freshwater programming, we encourage you to make a donation today. A gift of any size counts. See the chat for a link on where to give. And the best part, all contributions made today through 11:59 p.m. tomorrow night will be doubled and help us unlock a $10,000 match. Thank you for improving water for Minnesotans and communities downstream. We're about to start our presentation, and I just want to note that the presentation was recorded in advance and that Dr. Sedlak is going to join us live for the Q&A at the end. The whole event will be going about 15 minutes past 1 p.m. To allow for the Q&A with our panelist, David Pernitsky. We invite people to enter any questions that you might have during the event into the chat, and we will collect those and add to the moderated discussion at the end. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Sedlak. He is a Plato Malazimov Professor and Director of the University of California, Berkeley Water Center. Having earned his PhD in water chemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Sedlak's research focuses on the fate of chemical contaminants with the long-term goal of developing cost-effective, safe, and sustainable systems to manage water resources. He's particularly interested in the development of local sources of water. His research has addressed water reuse, as well as the treatment and use of urban runoff to contaminated groundwater from contaminated industrial sites as water supplies. Currently, his research group focuses on topics including the use of engineered treatment wetlands to remove chemicals from effluent impacted waters, treatment and management of concentrate from water reuse and desalination processes, the fate, transport, and transformation of poly and perfluorinated substances, otherwise known as PFAS, and the development of passive systems for treatment of chemicals in urban runoff. With that, we will go to Dr. Sedlak's presentation.
Thank you very much for having me as the Moos family speaker for this year's seminar series. I'm quite honored to be here because you've had a wonderful group of speakers in your previous meetings. In fact, it makes me a little nervous when I think about all the other wonderful speakers and all the insights they've been able to give you about the complex world of water. I'm also a little bit nervous today because of the subject matter. I've been teaching and conducting research and talking around the world about issues related to water for over 25 years. But it is actually rather recent that I've started to expand my horizons to think about getting outside of my comfort zone of the environmental chemistry and treatment of water systems, and even beyond that, the comfort zone of working on water supplies in water-stressed parts of the Western United States. But I've started to think about these larger global water issues that are the subject of today's seminar, and it makes me a little bit nervous because I've seen cases where experts come in from the outside and purport to know about the complex issues occurring in other countries or in other disciplines and realize that it's quite possible to make mistakes. So I hope you'll bear with me because I, like you, am learning about the complex interdependencies of water systems, and I'm hoping to find insights in the area that I'm most familiar with that can be applied to other areas. Now you'll see the title for the talk, Water for All, 3 Paths to a Better Water Future. It actually is a set of different numbers that you need to remember for this talk today. So it's not just 3, it's 4 for 4 revolutions, which I'll tell you about in a moment, 3 for the 3 paths, and 6 for the 6 global water crises. So keep that in mind, 4, 6, and 3, and you'll be able to follow the seminar just fine. Now, where does the 4 come from? Well, the 4 comes from this idea of Water 4.0, a book that I wrote that was published in 2014. And that book addressed the global, the water crises that I was seeing in the parts of the world where I work, which tends to be the West United States. And in order to tell the story about water systems and the new system that's being developed to provide water to water-stressed parts of places like the United States, but other parts of the world, I went back and thought a little about the history. And in fact, the history of that system became the basis for Water 4.0. So let me walk you through this quickly so you can see how my thinking started to evolve around the topics of water systems and the relationship to society beyond just the technical issues. The first revolution in water, which we sometimes call Water 1.0 or the first water revolution, can be ascribed to the Romans. And in the book, I give them a lot of credit for what they were able to do. So over 2,000 years ago, the Romans were able to build imported water systems that worked simply with the forces of gravity and simple primitive construction technologies to provide people living within cities with water volumes that are similar to what we use in contemporary modern cities. For example, at the height of the Roman Empire, people were getting something like 400 liters per person per day of clean water piped into their city through the aqueducts like this one, which is actually in France, shown in this picture, and many others that were operating around the Roman Empire. And that idea that we could bring water into cities from great distances became a revolution because it allowed people to live in close proximity. You could not have a city of 1 million or 2 or 10 million people or even 50 million people in the world without having a water supply that provided an adequate amount of water, with very few exceptions, like living on the Great Lakes, perhaps. And so thinking like an engineer, we can see that first water revolution created a linear system where water came in on one side, went into the city, and went out on the other side. So the Romans not only gave us imported water supply and aqueducts and piping and fountains, but they also gave us sewers to get water out of the city after it's been used. So that really was a revolution. The second revolution in water systems is drinking water treatment. So during the time of the Industrial Revolution, when cities around the world started growing again, we ran into a situation where the waste from an upstream city, the sewers of the upstream city, contaminated the drinking water supply of a downstream city. And that led to things like typhoid fever and cholera outbreaks. And the way in which that was addressed was by the creation of drinking water treatment. So in the book, I tell the story of Lawrence and Lowell in Massachusetts, 2 of the largest cities in America or rather 2 large cities in America at the turn of the 20th century, and the way in which engineers from MIT's Lawrence Experimental Station helped perfect the idea of slow sand filtration and drinking water treatment. And that technology, coupled with chlorination and other forms of disinfection that came along later, had a huge impact on public health, extending the lifespans of people in wealthy countries during the 20th century by somewhere around 10 or 12 years. So that was truly a revolution. And after that point, we wouldn't think about building a city's water supply without installing a drinking water treatment plant. And so we put another box in our schematic, but it's still a linear system with water coming in one end and out the other end. The third water revolution was a revolution that came about in response to concerns about pollution. So this photo here shows you the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland, Ohio, catching on fire in the year 1969. This was actually the 9th time that the river had caught on fire. It had caught on fire many times before that, but it was only late in the 1960s and early 70s that the public was so concerned about the impacts of pollution on water supplies, or the effects of of pollution on the environment that we got serious and started building wastewater treatment plants. And so within a period of about 20 or 30 years in the United States with the Clean Water Act, but in other parts of the wealthy world, we saw the billions of dollars go into the construction and upgrading of sewage treatment plants. And a couple of decades later, the world was, the waterways of the world were clean enough that people felt that they could fish and swim in surface waters that had recently just been so polluted that you wouldn't even go near them. So this was truly a revolution. And so at least in the wealthy part of the world, we added another box to the schematic of the water supply, and that box was wastewater treatment plants. Now, in my own work in parts of the country where there's water scarcity, we like to think about this fourth revolution, and that's what Water 4.0 is all about. It's about the next stage in the world's evolution of water supplies, and that is the creation of a revolution where water now moves in a more close cycle or circulates and is recycled around the city. And so whether it's taking the resources, the sewage coming out of the cities and turning it into non-potable water or to potable water and reusing it within the city, or using the sewage from the city and using it to recharge an aquifer, or maybe the stormwater runoff falling in the city and using it to recharge the water supply, we start closing the loops and making our water go further. And that has been an area where there's been major investments in places like, not only places like California, but in Texas and Florida and Singapore and Australia in recent years, and is likely to expand in the future. And so often when I talk about this idea of Water 4.0, or I talk about what's happening next with cities and their water supply, I liken it to 4 different taps that engineers are trying to open up to diversify what used to be exclusively imported and local sources of water. I didn't mention it yet, but seawater desalination and brackish water desalination is an important technology. I'll mention it a little bit later on in the lecture. Water reuse, the idea of recycling wastewater, which I alluded to in the previous slide. Water conservation, the idea that if we're going to start investing in all of these ways of recycling water within cities and finding new sources of water, we should figure out how to first conserve water and use it effectively. And finally, stormwater harvesting, the idea of capturing water as it falls into the city and moves through the streets instead of just releasing it to the environment where it could become a source of pollution. And so this is the world that I live in my research. It's the world that I wrote about in Water 4.0. And it's a world that I find fascinating and find a lot of interesting areas of research. But after I wrote Water 4.0, I started to talk with people in other parts of the world who are dealing with other types of water issues. And the conversations often got around to the question of, what do we learn from the experience in wealthy, water-stressed parts of the world that can be applied to other types of water problems? And so over the past couple of years, I've spent some time traveling and talking to people and reading and thinking about the nature of the water challenges beyond just water-stressed cities in wealthy countries. And I've realized that there isn't just one water crisis that we have to think about or one challenge. There's actually these 6 different water crises that happen simultaneously. And so I'd like to kind of run you through this idea that there's not just one global water crisis, but there are 6 different classes of water challenges or crises that the world faces from time to time. Sometimes a city can be grappling with multiple crises at the same time. Sometimes the crises require fundamentally different approaches to solve them. But what I'd like to assert today is that the things that we learn as we're addressing one type of crisis can be quite useful when we're trying to address other types of crises and solve other kinds of problems. And so let me run you through these 6 water crises, give you some quick examples. You're probably familiar with some of them already, but if you could think about them in this context, I think it will help you see that there's a path through the different types of solutions, and there are commonalities as we look to solutions to the world's water crises. Maybe the best way to start is to think about the challenge of supplying water to cities, which are the first three crises after all. And I'm very influenced here by the work of the Swedish public health expert Hans Rosling, who convinced people at the United Nations and in other places to stop using the terms developed and developing world, and rather to think about the distribution of wealth and income around different parts of the world, and to see that distribution of income being in a state of constant change as places that we used to think of as poor suddenly become wealthy as change occurs, and global development has an impact on the way in which people live and how much money they have to spend on different types of resources. So if you look at this figure and you see on the bottom, we've got these let's see, 7 different Lego pieces, and each one accounts for about 1 billion people. So think about each of these little figures on the bottom representing about 1 billion people, and a logarithmic scale of these 4 different levels of income based upon the amount of income that these people have in a day. So this idea of like level 4, which is what most of us live at, that is over $32 a day of income, represents about 1 billion people in the world. And those billion people get water much in the way we do. They get water from a centralized utility, which cleans it, puts it through a water treatment plant, pressurizes it, sends it to their pipes, and in most cases puts it through a sewage treatment plant before sending it out to the environment. That's the topic that Water 4.0 was about. The water for the many, or the crisis of water for the many, refers to the 5 billion people in low and middle income countries. Many of those people, probably the majority of them, live in cities, and increasingly they're migrating to the cities looking for opportunity. And they're often served by water utilities that struggle financially. So these are water utilities that may not be able to deliver water that's pressurized 24 hours a day. They may lose a significant fraction, between 20 and 40% of the water that they put into their distribution system through leaks, and they struggle just to keep up. And those cities are growing very quickly and oftentimes don't have the kind of wealth that's necessary to go for the kinds of advanced treatment solutions that were the subject of Water 4.0. And then the third of these crises, or rather the third water crisis, is the crisis of water for the poor, represented here by about 1 billion people around the world who live on less than $2 a day. And those people tend not to get their water from a piped water supply. If they live in a city, they may buy the water from vendors, or they may use an inadequate water supply like a borehole. Or if they live in the countryside, they may rely upon traditional wells or other sources of water. And they face a different kind of challenge because they're trying to fend for themselves and find water, but they're distinctly different from the many. So those are the 3 crises of providing people with water. The remaining 3 crises don't involve providing people with tap water. They pertain to other aspects of the way in which we use water. So the 4th crisis is drinking water that's healthy. And I want to give the example of arsenic as one of the largest cases where people have access to adequate supplies of water, but the water makes them sick when they drink it. And many of you are probably already familiar with the situation in Bangladesh, where a well-meaning effort by global development organizations like the United Nations led to the construction or installation of shallow wells in the river delta region of Bangladesh, so that people could access their drinking water from groundwater and not rely upon surface water, which was often contaminated with waterborne pathogens. And so what the folks who supervised this transition didn't realize at the time was that the sediments in Bangladesh are very rich in arsenic. And so the people there started drinking water that was contaminated with high levels of arsenic. Something like 30 to 60% of the country was drinking levels of arsenic that were above the World Health Organization standards. And they realized that they had problems with various diseases, including cancer and something known as Blackfoot disease. When people recognized the extent of the problem, they thought that maybe the approach to solving it would be to equip people with household scale water treatment systems. And a diagram showing two different types of filters is indicated here that work on the similar principle, that you could pass the arsenic contaminated water through some sort of filter media where the arsenic would absorb either onto chips of bricks or iron oxides or rust or activated carbon, and then that would provide water that was healthy to drink. And that certainly is something that worked in the laboratory, but it didn't work very well in the field for a variety of reasons that aren't related to the technology, that are more related to the way in which people access new unfamiliar technologies. And so in the long run, one of the safest ways of dealing with the arsenic problem in Bangladesh was just to tell people not to drink from the wells that had high levels of arsenic. So in that Bangladesh Delta region, the concentrations of arsenic in the groundwater are quite spotty. And so you could have a clean well located pretty close to a contaminated well. And so one of the most effective strategies has turned out to be to paint the wells that have high levels of arsenic red and the ones that have low levels of arsenic green, and allow people to make the decision to access the safer water. Now, arsenic contamination in groundwater is not limited to Bangladesh. Worldwide, somewhere around 100 million people are drinking water that's contaminated with arsenic, and several million of them are here in the United States. And even though we live at this high standard of living and have expectations of clean, safe water, folks who access their water through a household or small community well often don't have the ability to treat the water and remove the arsenic. And so these problems are not just limited to the poorest people or people in low income countries. In fact, if you've read the newspapers lately about all the contamination with PFAS, you'll see that large utilities that have centralized treatment systems are often able to remove the PFAS, but people who access local wells are often in real trouble because there aren't adequate technologies that allow an individual homeowner to remove a chemical like that from their water supply. So that's the fourth global water crisis. The fifth one is water for food. And I'm illustrating here the issue of water for food by showing you the height of the groundwater in an area of India called Gujarat, where the invention of low-cost submersible pumps sowed the seeds for a global water crisis. By making it cheap to pump water from the ground, it was possible for farmers to borrow water from future generations. And as you can see here, the water table has sunk and sunk and sunk, and it's reaching a point where it won't be possible to grow food in that part of India anymore, and there could be an economic crisis. The problem with water for food, of course, is not limited to India. We know that in the United States, the Ogallala Aquifer and California's Central Valley are often being overexploited to grow food. And there are numerous aquifers and rivers around the world where our thirst for growing food has caused these kinds of problems. Now, as population continues to grow, it's been estimated that over the next 30 years, farmers are going to have to grow about 70% more food. And so this stress on our water supply to grow food is only going to intensify with time. And finally, the last of the six crises is water for the environment. And I think water for the environment as a crisis is dramatically illustrated by these NASA images of the Aral Sea shrinking between the year 2000 and 2013. And you can see very dramatically that this terminal lake in Central Asia has essentially dried up and has almost disappeared. And that's because much of the water that used to flow into the lake has been diverted, mainly for agriculture, but also for urban and industrial uses. And so terminal lakes are probably one of the most extreme examples, but there are many ecosystems around the world where the amount of water flowing into them is much less than it was. And there are many ecosystems around the world, like the Gulf of Mexico, where runoff from the Corn Belt in the United States drains and causes the dead zone, where pollution from human activities are stressing ecosystems. And so, this issue of of water for ecosystems often does come last, and it comes last among my 6 crises, but it's by no means the least important of the crises. It's just the one that often doesn't have as many constituents speaking to it. But let's now take this idea of these 6 water crises and think if we can start looking towards creating solutions or learning about where solutions might come from. And before I turn my attention to the solutions, though, I want you to recognize that we're not in a static place. In fact, if you're paying attention, you might even have the perception that these global water crises are happening with greater frequency in recent years. And if that's your perception, you're probably right, because we're still in the midst of something called the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration is this amazing time in the history of civilization where not only has population skyrocketed, but wealth and investment and energy use and technology and exploitation of natural resources has taken off in the period starting in the second half of the 20th century as the world rebuilt after the Second World War. So these 12 iconic images from the Great Acceleration tell part of the story about what's happened in the last 60 years. Actually, it's the last 70 years if you think about carrying it out to today. But if you look a little more closely at it, you'll see that it also shows that the development and extent of the pace of change is different in different parts of the world. If you look at the darker of the 3 orange figures, you'll see those are the OECD countries. Those are the wealthy countries where the billion rich people live. And you'll see that population in the OECD countries is flattening out. In fact, in many parts of Western Europe and in Japan, population is flat and even declining, and will do so throughout the 21st century. If you look closely, you'll also see the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are starting to decrease their growth rate of population growth as well. And in the second half of the 21st century, they too should level out in terms of population. And so going into the 21st century, it really is the others, and in particular, sub-Saharan Africa, where we can expect the largest increases in population and the most economic development. And these are the places we need to think about in the future. The other thing that's important to keep in mind when you think about the Great Acceleration is that we have to prepare for the Great Deceleration. And by Great Deceleration, I don't mean that the standard of living in the world is going to decrease. I only mean that the rate of change, the rate of population growth, the rate at which we use up our natural resources is going to slow down as we try to make the transition to sustainability. So when you think about sustainability, it's about managing the Great Deceleration in different parts of the world. And as we think about water technologies or approaches for solving the world's water problems, we have to recognize the types of changes that we're facing, not only in the next 3 decades as we go to 2050, but throughout the rest of the 21st century. Now, if we're going to take the long view of society and think about what's happening in the 21st century, we probably also need to think about climate change. If you're like me and you live in California and you've experienced wildfires and heat waves in the past few years, you have the inkling that climate change is already here. Perhaps where you live, you notice changes, or if you think about hurricanes and other types of things happening. The way in which climate change is going to play out in the 21st century is already pretty clear to the climate scientists and is becoming even more evident from the models. And I just wanted to give you a little taste of the subtleties in climate change and how it's going to affect water for cities and for growing food and similar types of activities by giving you the example of Australia, which came out of the millennial drought in about the year 2010, so a 10-year drought where they had much less than the average amount of precipitation. And this figure here indicates the most likely explanation, and that's the widening of the Hadley cells that determine the jet stream that brings the winter storms to Australia. And so when you're looking at water in the area around Melbourne in the southern part of Australia or over in Perth, you'll see that the tracks of the winter storms have changed, meaning that they've had a noticeable and possibly permanent decrease in the amount of winter rainfall. Similar types of phenomena are already becoming evident as the glaciers in Peru start to melt, as the snowpack in North America transitions away, and we end up with more rain falling in the Rocky Mountains and the Cascades in the Sierra Nevada. So we're starting to see climate change, and climate change will tend to shrink the amount of water resources available in the places that are already struggling to provide water. So the moral of the story for climate change is the wet places get wetter and the dry places get drier. The dry places are the ones that are struggling with these water crises. So that's my 4 revolutions and 6 water crises. Now let's think about the 3 paths to solutions. And my first path to solution is efficiency. You really can't think about solving a global resource problem without first asking the question of whether or not you're using the resource efficiently. And to start thinking about that, I want to think about an area where we're probably a little more advanced in the way we think about efficiency, and that's energy. And I'll tell you a story about electricity consumption in the United States, starting with Arab oil embargo of the early 1970s, which was a wake-up call to people in California about the risks of relying upon an energy-intensive society. And so before California started transitioning to solar power, the wiser decision was to think about energy efficiency. And this man here, Art Rosenfeld, who at the time was a high energy physicist at UC Berkeley, recognized that there were tremendous gains possible in solving the global energy problem by first turning towards efficiency. So he helped popularize the compact fluorescent light bulb that you see him holding there. He helped California adopt appliance standards and things that weren't really quite as glamorous as high energy physics, but through his efforts and efforts of others who really put a focus on efficiency, per capita electricity use in California has remained essentially flat over the last 40 years or 50 years, while our society has become much more electricity intensive as we put computers in our houses and put in bigger television sets and relied more and more on electricity. Whereas in the rest of the United States, the per capita electricity use has almost doubled. And that's because if you don't pay attention to efficiency, you just won't manage to make those changes. And so what if we had an Art Rosenfeld thinking about water efficiency in the United States? How far would we get? Well, one of the places to think about this is to think about urban water efficiency and think in terms of per capita residential water use. So when you look at a city, it's hard to compare the amount of water that they use if you just focus on the total amount in the city, because some cities have a lot of industry or some cities have a lot of landscaping. But if we just think about the amount of water that people use for their homes, you can see big differences between Europe and the United States. Whereas the most efficient cities in Europe use somewhere around 100 liters per person per day. Cities like Los Angeles and New York and Phoenix use somewhere around 400 liters per person per day. And maybe more conservation aware cities like San Francisco still use about twice as much water as Europe. Now, the question of how far that efficiency can go in the United States is up for debate. We've made tremendous progress in the last few decades, but ultimately it seems unlikely to me that we'll get to the same place as Europe because of the way that our cities are configured. We have much lower population densities in our cities, which means that a fair amount of our water is used outdoors. And we also have different demographics, but suffice to say that we could probably reduce urban per capita water use by 25 to 40% and solve a lot of our problems in the United States in water-stressed cities. Of course, many of those water-stressed cities are growing at rates of 0.5% or 1% per year. So this water conservation will probably be canceled out over the next 3 decades by increases in population growth. Thinking about water for the many, we can turn to Latin America, for example, and see Mexico City, which has some of the most expensive water in the world because it has to get pumped up into the city across a valley. Mexico City using somewhere around 300 liters per person per day. And Mexico City has this serious challenge with water and yet struggles with water efficiency, not because they lack the technology, but because of institutional problems with the way in which water is funded and financed and caught up in political controversies. But it does seem to me that we have a lot of room for realizing the benefits of conservation if we could just figure out a way around some of the logistical issues. There are technical opportunities to reduce water use in water systems. This is an example of some work that came out of the Renew Engineering Research Center that I'm affiliated with through the National Science Foundation. Researchers at UC Berkeley showed that not only can you save money by managing the pressure of water and water distribution systems, but you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If any of you are familiar with the McKinsey curve, the way in which people look at different investments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you might remember that anything below the line means that it's cost effective as an investment. It actually returns on money. And the width of those bars tell you the amount of energy being, greenhouse gases being saved, the size of the opportunity. And these technologies of pressure management and leak management have tremendous opportunities to reduce the amount of water lost as water is being piped around a city through leaks. It's simply like if you have a garden hose in your yard and you turn down the pressure while it's not running, less water will shoot out of the tiny cracks in the pipe. Water efficiency is also an important issue when we turn our attention to agriculture. And many of you recognize that one of the largest users of water anywhere in the world is irrigated agriculture. And so that challenge of water to grow food must have an efficiency component to it. We can look around the world and see many examples of drip irrigation and high-tech efficiency measures, but I think the one that has the greatest potential in the future is to think about water efficiency in agriculture in terms of yields of crops. And so this figure illustrates the corn yield in tons per acre in the corn belt of the American Midwest from the 1940s to the early 2000s. And you can see almost a 5-fold improvement in corn yields, largely through the impacts of better breeding, better plant breeding and fertilizer applications. And similarly, throughout the Green Revolution, whether we look at rice or wheat or other crops, we can see that farmers have learned to grow more food on the same amount of land by making the system more efficient. Now, some of this growth in corn yields comes from additional irrigation being used on corn farms, and also the same can be said of wheat around the world. But I think it's important to recognize that as we turn our attention to growing 70% more food in the next 30 years, we're going to do it on very little additional land. We're going to do it mainly by agricultural intensification. And this is also a potential opportunity to save a lot of water. So the first of the 3 paths for solving the world's water crises involves involves efficiency. The second is technology. And I think the best way to illustrate the impact of technological innovation in water is to turn back the clock to President Kennedy's 1961 State of the Union address, where he told the world that one of the main objectives of his administration was going to be seawater desalination, because he thought it would be a great harbinger of global peace and an accomplishment for humanity. Well, very quickly, the Cold War sucked him in, and he ended up spending the money and time that he would have put into seawater desalination into the space program. But Kennedy did create something called the Office of Saline Research. And out of the Office of Saline Research, some researchers at UCLA ended up inventing a device known as reverse osmosis membrane. And the reverse osmosis membrane, as it's gone through technological innovation and development over the last 5.5 decades, has reached a point where it's mature and it's being used to provide water around the world. So this figure shows you the increase in seawater desalination capacity around the world. You'll see that the amount of desalinated seawater is approximately doubling every decade. And if you look at the different countries where that desalinated seawater is coming from, it used to come primarily from places like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but increasingly countries like Israel and Australia and the United States are adopting seawater desalination. In fact, something like 70% of Israel's drinking water now comes from desalinated seawater. And in the United States, we built a major desalination plant near San Diego, which provides 200 million liters per person, per day of water to thirsty Southern California. And that's through the result of that technological innovation. Somewhere around 300 million people around the world are acquiring their drinking water from desalinated seawater. The other important impact of the invention of the reverse osmosis membrane has been the spread of potable water reuse. That is the idea that we can take sewage effluent and turn it into drinking water. When we do that in California, we tend to do that through the use of reverse osmosis. When we do that in many other parts of the country, for example, in Atlanta or in Virginia and other places where we have significant amounts of potable water reuse, we don't always use reverse osmosis because those cities are located inland. And so that's why I've separated the United States and California. It's not for political reasons, but if you look at those squares, each of those squares represents about 100 million liters per day of capacity. So worldwide, the United States is probably the leader in potable water recycling, followed closely by Singapore and Australia, and a small project in Namibia, and then Belgium and the UK. But this technology of turning sewage into drinking water, the one that I talk about in Water 4.0, is growing by leaps and bounds as a result of that technological innovation. And so when we think about these two technological innovations, seawater desalination and potable water recycling, we can ask the question, could they diffuse to low and middle income countries? Could they solve some of the water problems for the many? Well, what I've done here is I've plotted the per capita GDP of a series of different cities in North America and the Middle East and Oceania, where desalination or reuse have become important versus their population. And then I've plotted a number of other cities that struggle with water supply. And what you can see is these other cities are not as wealthy as the cities that have yet built desalination plants and potable water recycling facilities. And so we could think about the way in which global development is making countries wealthier and wait for them to get to that point where they could afford them. Or we can engage in technological research designed to drive down the costs of desalination. Along the lines of the latter, I'm a member of a team that is funded by the Department of Energy to develop this next generation of advanced water treatment for desalination. It's called the National Alliance for Water Innovation, or NAWI. And this is a 25 million plus annual investment from the Department of Energy to try to take desalination to the next level. And what you can see on the map here is the primary consortium members of the research program, but it's open to people from all over, all universities and all folks interested in water and water technologies. But our goal is to get to the same place, or rather to take the vision from President Kennedy and continue to expand it in order to drop the cost of desalination and not only make it accessible to people in low and middle income countries, but to increase the use of desalination in things like industrial water processes and agriculture. So NAWI has a vision for how we do our research, and I don't have a great deal of time to go into it today, but what we call it is A prime, which stands for autonomous, precision, resilient, intensified modularization and electrification. You can see it here. But it's this idea that we can make this next jump in desalination by taking advantage of technological innovations that have accrued in the past 3 decades. So in the autonomous water area, we can take the innovations from the development of sensors and actuators coupled with information technology to improve the efficiency of water treatment plants and to help water desalination operate independently. precision separations. Rather than relying upon brute force methods like activated carbon, we can make sorbents that specifically remove contaminants, thereby reducing the costs of treating things like PFAS and arsenic when it shows up in someone's water supply. Resilient, developing the ability for water systems to adjust when the quality of water coming in changes rapidly. And that's a hallmark of some of the types of water supplies that we're trying to access, like stormwater runoff and wastewater. Intensified brine treatment. When we try to use desalination for groundwater supplies, we often find that we can desalinate the water just fine, but at the end we're left with hundreds of millions of gallons of salty water to dispose of. So finding a way to deal with that as one of our problems. Modularization, the idea that we can develop water treatment technologies that can be manufactured at scale for a lot less money. And finally, electrification, the idea that rather than using chemicals like iron and alum and flocculants and antiscalants, we can generate chemicals in situ using electrochemistry. We're working now on a roadmap for NAWI and for water desalination, and it should be released early in 2021. So please look at the NAWI website if you want to see some of the details of how we hope to realize this. In my own research, I've been also thinking about this idea, and one of the things that I'm kind of intrigued by is the idea that you might actually be able to have personalized water systems, or have a water treatment system at the household scale that could take your roof water and the water you use in your home and put those together and treat them and recycle them, so that you don't have to rely upon the water supply or a diminished groundwater supply as your water source, and how those technologies can ultimately scale and lead to the development of industries that could start to serve low and middle income communities and rural communities that aren't quite as wealthy. So if you want to read about that, that came out in a paper earlier this year. Okay, so 2 paths. Now, the third path for water systems is a little bit different. This third path is, I'll call it a redefined relationship. So our relationship with water has always been one of a resource that's there for exploitation. And that's the primary reason why the Six Water Crisis, water for the environment, is such a hard one to solve. Well, I think that we can redefine this relationship as a way of solving some of our global water crises. And one of the ways we can redefine it is legally. So about 3 years ago in New Zealand, the Maori tribe pursued a lawsuit, and they managed to gain legal status for a river to be treated as a human being. And what legal status of a river means is that before people take water from that river and before people pollute that river, they have to treat it like a human being and deal with its primary rights. Now, maybe the idea of a human right for a water body is something that's unique to Maori culture and the Constitution of New Zealand, but we have something similar here in the United States and in the United Kingdom and many other places, called the Public Trust Doctrine, which was the basis through which the exploitation of Mono Lake in California was fought by the Mono Lake Committee. So the Public Trust Doctrine comes from English common law, and it says that water and other resources that are common goods are not properties that people can own indefinitely, that when the greater good of society is satisfied, those rights can revert back to the state. And the argument that the city of Los Angeles taking the water supply away from Mono Lake was causing an ecological problem was the basis through which the city of Los Angeles had to give up some of that water and allow the level in Mono Lake to be restored. And you can see in this figure, the level in Mono Lake increasing after the 1995 injunction and the way in which that was realized. Now, what does this mean to me as a researcher? Well, I also see opportunities in terms of research to think about the way in which our water systems are managed and oftentimes mismanaged, and to see if there are ways in which, if we're going to have this infrastructure and not going to abandon it, we can at least use the infrastructure to improve the water quality. One of those ways has been through the use of horizontal levees, or sometimes called living levees. And this is a technology that we've been developing in the San Francisco Bay to protect the city from the effects of sea level rise. And so what you can see in this schematic is a side view of the horizontal levee. And on the left-hand side of the levee, you have to imagine is the city and the traditional concrete levee protecting the city. And between that levee and the bay, there is this subsurface wetland where we're growing plants on the surface to absorb the energy of storms. So if a storm comes, rather than hitting the levee and possibly causing it to fail, the energy is absorbed by the wetland. And to support this wetland, which is growing at an elevation above the water table, we're taking nitrified wastewater effluent from the sewage treatment plant and passing it through the subsurface. And in the process, that water is being treated and the nutrients are being removed. And as you can see from this image, it's actually a pretty delightful place to go, because rather than growing our wetland with nuisance plants like cattails and bulrush, we're actually using native species that provide habitat for the ecosystem. And so discussions about this approach have led to proposals around the Bay to rethink the way in which we reintroduce wastewater into the San Francisco Bay, and to use it to create horizontal levees in different parts of the Bay and try to replicate the way in which water used to flow on the margins of the Bay. So instead of being discharged to the Bay through a pipe, it's percolating through a wetland system where it supports habitat. So some final thoughts before we move into our discussion is that I think that there are a number of water challenges that the world faces. And when you think about climate change and increasing population growth, you can tell that those water challenges are only going to grow in the future. And so we probably need not one or two or a combination of the two, but we need all three types of approaches and all of the above approach. Water use efficiency is really important, but it's been very hard without the ability to raise the cost of water. So without a price signal, just like everything, it's hard to convince people to change their habits. Technological innovations like President Kennedy's funding of the Office of Saline Water Research take decades to diffuse. So we have to keep being patient, but focusing on the real prizes and the path through developing new technologies. And finally, this idea that a redefined relationship is probably ultimately the key to creating the incentives for people to work on water. So in conclusion, I just want to recognize the support from the National Science Foundation through the Renew It program and the continued efforts of the National Alliance for Water Innovation. And I look forward to discussion.
Great. Well, thank you very much, David. Enjoyed that presentation. I would like to now invite Dr. Sedlak and our other panelist, David Pernitsky, to join the panel. And while they're turning on their videos and unmuting themselves, I will also remind people that if you have any questions, you can please enter them in the chat so that we can answer those. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Pernitsky. He is Stantec's global practice leader for drinking water, and he leads Stantec's technical team for ensuring that appropriate technology are used on projects. He's worked on large centralized water plants around the world, as well as very small systems in Canada's north. He has a bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Alberta and a PhD in environmental engineering from the University of Massachusetts. He works in Stantec's Calgary, Canada office. I would also like to bring Carrie Jennings on to the screen. She's here, and Carrie will be moderating the panel discussion. So thank you all and welcome.
Thank you, Dean Forbes. David, we see your name, but we don't see your video. So if you could turn that on so we could see
yeah, I'm
the other David, right?
right, the other David.
Yeah, my microphone's working, but I The start video button doesn't seem to be working.
So maybe one of our hosts, our co-host, Link, can you start his video? Well, let me just get started with the first question. Thank you, Dr. Sedlak. And I think maybe I'll mute you, David Pernitsky, and if confusing two Davids on the panel. So I'm gonna, yeah, there we go. Mute him until he gets his camera going. I think we have quite a few questions that were motivated by your summation about, what motivates a group to act on this if there is no water use efficiency motivation without a price tag. So especially in the midst of a pandemic, it seems like addressing these challenges and pursuing the three paths will require a really broad buy-in to an ethos that holds that all people should have access to clean, reliable water, and a willingness to do what it takes to make that happen, even for people we don't know. So what gives you hope that we can get there?
And thanks, Carrie, and thanks everyone for sticking around for the presentation. I really do appreciate that question. I've given it a lot of thought, and part of the reason why I broke this up into the 6 water challenges is that it can be a little overwhelming to think about, well, you've got the very poorest people in the world who don't have access to water, and that's one kind of problem. And you've got the problem of the dead zones and disappearing lakes, that's another problem. And then you've got problems like California or the Colorado Basin and cities and farms running out of water. And so what gives me hope, or what I see as the path, is kind of a better understanding that we have the tools to solve the world's water crises at our fingertips. And I think that, I'm most optimistic when I look at the way in which California's cities rode out the last water crisis. We had a drought that lasted close to a decade that was unprecedented, and yet we had no water rationing. We had very little economic damage in our cities because we had been doing the right things. And when we needed to, we bumped up the technologies and went down this path of Water 4.0. And so I think with a little bit of work in low and middle income countries and for US industry, we could make similar kinds of improvements. The other thing that gives me hope for low-income countries, especially the very poorest people, is the progress we're making in global development and also the Sustainable Development Goals. So within the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, goal number 6 has safe and affordable water access for everyone. And actually, we're on a path to get there. So maybe the sanitation goal is a little more challenging, but we've made tremendous progress in places like Ethiopia and other countries where the development approach and charitable organizations and NGOs and economic growth have come together. And within a period of decades, we've seen water access increase considerably. And so we know it's possible based upon the experiences. We know that we have the technologies, we know we have case studies and models, and now we have increasing consciousness. So I don't feel hopeless about it. I feel like there's these 3 paths get us there, but learning more about it and making a bigger commitment is certainly the important aspect to it.
Right, and paying for it. I mean, it is typical for people not to pay attention until there is a crisis. Is there a way we can leverage people to change behaviors to avoid crises rather than waiting for the crisis to happen? Or, for example, we have had some challenges with our pressures on our water system because of other people's crises. Recently, there was a proposal to ship water out of Minnesota to someplace in the desert Southwest. How do we balance those competing crises?
Well, for me, Carrie, the big insight writing Water 4.0 is that change usually comes in response to crises. And so I've seen that it's very hard. It's the social scientists refer to this as a window of opportunity. And so the windows of opportunity is open, and you better have the ideas. And we saw in the 2008 economic downturn, the kinds of infrastructure projects that got funded were the shovel-ready projects. And in the period of great growth after World War II, we saw that there were ideas that had developed in the time of the Great Depression that got built, whether it was electrification or automobiles and highways. So I think that we have to recognize the fact that it's not a linear process of growth and change, but we have to be doing the work on the ground so that when society decides it's time to invest large amounts of money in change, there are ideas that aren't just more of the same. And I see climate change and climate change adaptation as one of the big coming opportunities to rethink our relationship with water. And it's up to us in the water community to have those ideas, even if they're not being funded yet, to have them tested and have them shovel ready when it's time to go.
And I will get to audience questions, but I see that Dr. Pernitsky has now joined us with his camera. So if someone would unmute him now, I'd like to give you an opportunity to say, in your global work in water, what is motivating the people that come to Stantec to do the projects that you're leading? So we need to unmute him. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. How's that?
Perfect.
Good. All right. Yeah, that's we're finding that the people who are like joining Stantec, the young people coming out of university, the environmental ethic that they bring is way different than and more widespread than we've ever seen before. So people want to make a difference. People want to do something proactive and benefits their communities. And water is a big one. And I think that I really enjoyed this presentation because it gave us a chance to take a look at the very big picture. So in my work, I often get involved in the infrastructure projects, that are solving a specific problem or looking at a specific place in time. And this is really important to see that there is a difference between, what we're going to do in a big centralized city that already has a water distribution system and infrastructure all in place versus a place where where that's not the case, or the pipe system is leaking an awful lot, or there's competing demands with agriculture and that. And so I think that's encouraging. And the other thing I'd say is really encouraging is this. It's got a lot of names, but the concept of one water. So the water that you're taking for drinking water is we have to separate. It's not just flush this down here or put this in the sewer and get rid of it. That has to be looked at kind of holistically. And that's where I think we're seeing things on infrastructure projects where can we take a waste product and before it's discharged to the environment and some kind of a contaminant gets diluted into a larger volume, can we take that, can we treat it when it's concentrated, can we reuse it somewhere on site? Looking at the different values of water we have. This is a highly contaminated stream, this is a low contaminated stream, but it's not good enough for direct discharge. And how can we reuse it with the minimal amount of treatment so we have the minimal amount of carbon footprint and chemical usage going in there?
Good. We have a question that came in from Lynn Broadus about agricultural intensification, which comes with population growth, and it's a topic of frequent conversation here in the upper Midwest, also in the little farther west, like on the Ogallala. So along with concerns about the amount of water that's being used and the impact on water quality, can you address any opportunities for regenerative agriculture or improved soil health that will help us produce the same amount of food without the impacts on water quantity and quality? Either one of you?
Yes, well, first of all, Lynn, it's good to hear you're there. I guess I don't get to see you, but I see you every now and then, and you've taught me a lot about water and water in the Midwest. I do see that we can't forget about this because we're not only going to need to produce the same amount of food, we're going to have to produce 70% more food on more or less the same amount of land. And we have to focus on more than just increasing yields. We have to think about the environmental impact. I see that a lot of the direction is going towards precision agriculture and agricultural intensification, but that doesn't always deliver the promised decreases in environmental impact. And so regenerative agriculture and paying more attention to soil health seems to be one possible path, especially when we think about the implications for soil erosion and for carbon sequestration in that process. I think the big challenge for regenerative agriculture and approaches that don't fit along the path of industrialized types of intensification will be getting the buy-in from the growers and the farmers who are being encouraged to adopt things like high-tech seeds and cultivars and drones and sensors and things like that. And there has to be with it either subsidies or an economic model that makes it more attractive. And I think with that, we would be able to follow that path a little more closely.
Dr. Pernitsky, do you work in the agricultural sector?
Well, what I do see is a bit of a change in focus in our municipal wastewater treatment plants, in that rather than, they've been changing our focus a little bit from just treat and discharge to looking at the resources that we can recover. So, there's a lot of nutrients, there's a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus that can come out of municipal wastewater. And so we already have it there. So if we can look at those facilities as resource recovery plants, then maybe we can get some benefits that impact agriculture. So it's a change that we are seeing.
Your video was frozen for most of the questions, so you look like the best ventriloquist ever. There's a question coming in about paying for this change. Globally, these paths will require a shift of funding from wealthy countries to poor countries, but also an increase in paying for clean, reliable water in the wealthy nations. Looking to the US specifically, we struggle already to pay for our aging and inadequate water infrastructure. How do we pay for work on these three paths? And thinking about low-income urban and rural residents, who should be responsible for paying for clean, reliable water for them? Either of you.
Yeah, I mean, Carrie, I'll start and then let David talk about it. But I guess I see, two parallel discussions here in terms of water and sanitation access for the poorest people in the world and water and sanitation access here with the United States. And they're tied together by the human right to water. And so historically, we've thought about water services in a schizophrenic manner. Sometimes it's a public good, and sometimes it's a private sector responsibility. With the adoption of the human right to water by the United Nations and by the state of California, we have more of a legal basis and maybe more of a platform for talking about the fact that as citizens, you are entitled to access to water. It doesn't mean the water has to be free, but it does mean that society makes a commitment that there's some minimum amount of water that if people are unable to pay for it, it's subsidized. And so I think there are communities, rural communities, are in particular in the United States, where subsidies have to be considered. And in urban environments, we already do this. We have cross subsidies where wealthier users within the city help offer discounts or subsidies to the less fortunate people. We have to extend that when we have cities where there's no one who's wealthy enough to subsidize the rest of the community. And I think that that is more of a public policy discussion, but if we can frame it in the context of human right to water, I think it makes it more easily understandable and gets us to a different place in the political process.
Anything to add, Dr. Pernitsky?
Well, yeah, I think it is very much a public policy issue, but there are some good opportunities. So there's a couple of things. The framework for financing these things differs in each country and how they're governed. And I know in a lot of places they in Canada here, there's a lot of jurisdictions that say that the water utility has to be self-sufficient by its rates, so that the rates must cover the operation of the utilities. So you can't siphon water rates off to, this is Canada, build a new hockey arena, and vice versa. But we also need to recognize that maybe those rural communities, that they are in the upstream watershed, and so perhaps we've seen some situations here where the larger city has paid for the infrastructure to pay for the wastewater treatment of the smaller communities that would otherwise be discharging that upstream of their drinking water plant. So it's a political, it's public policy, it's cooperation more so than technical, but it's very important.
Yeah, one of our questioners addresses that it's really a change in social norms. I I want to just acknowledge the time. We are at 1:13 and we promised people we wouldn't go too long. I'm trying to think of a good way to wrap up the question or wrap up the questioning period. Do either of you have things that you would like to say that you haven't been able to address already?
Well, I would want to just end by thanking you for inviting me and thanking everyone for sticking around for the discussion and letting people online know that they can always send me an email, sedlak@berkeley.edu. That's pretty straightforward. But that, you know, this is a complex topic when we talk about water at this big level. And I hope that I've given you a way to think about addressing it in different pieces. And we like to think about what we can do as individuals, and there certainly are things we can do in terms of conservation. But I think the larger thing is to educate ourselves and to support the policies that create the water systems that we want. And I think that there are examples all around us of successes and failures. And the more we know about those, the more we can try to model our behavior after them. So thanks again, and yeah, no, just a great opportunity to have a discussion on the topic.
Dr. Pernitsky, any closing thoughts or things that you want us to know about your work?
Well, no, I thank for the opportunity, and I think that it's organizations like this that, you know, if water is important into people's minds, like you saw in that example from New Zealand, if it's important to the public, if the fish in their river are not being affected by pollution, it's that grassroots that makes those changes. The technology we can figure out, and like the research work Dr. Sedlak is doing is great. That sets the framework for what we can do, and it's the public pressure and the public's attitude that will determine, I think, what we will do. So thank you guys for that.
Well, I think with that, I'm just going to close and thank you both again, Dr. Sedlak and Dr. Pernitsky, and our sponsors, Stantec and the Canadian Consulate, who are here in Minneapolis, and all of you who joined us online, especially of those who stuck around until the end. We've got 100 of you still on the line. So if you want to see this again or pass the recording along, it will be available on Freshwater's website. Enjoy your day and think again about Give to the Max. Thanks, everybody.